A federally funded nonprofit agency that monitors how the state of New York treats people with developmental disabilities is suing the state. The group Disability Rights New York is a watchdog organization. The lawsuit it has filed against OPWDD, the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, alleges that the agency is in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act for keeping adults institutionalized beyond the age of 21. Joining us with more is Julie Michaels-Keegan, Program Director for the People with Developmental Disabilities at Disability Rights New York. Julie, welcome to the Capitol Press Room. How are you?
I'm great, Susan. Thanks for having us.
Maybe we should start with the relationship that your organization, Disability Rights New York, which is a federal organization, has with the state's OPWDD. What is that relationship? What's the context there?
Sure, I'm happy to elaborate on that. We're actually not a federal agency. We are an independent agency that is funded by the federal government. We're part of a protection and advocacy system. Each state in the country has a protection and advocacy system, so we're funded to, as you mentioned before, serve as a watchdog agency and advance the rights of individuals with disabilities.
So you're not a federal agency, but you receive money from the federal government.
Exactly.
So you're independent. Tell us about this lawsuit and why you decided to bring it.
Well, this lawsuit is kind of the result of a lot of research and investigation on our part. We had received complaints of abuse and neglect of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities in residential schools within New York State and out of New York State. And while we were able to resolve a lot of these issues on an individual basis, there was a greater systemic issue. And so we really wanted to look at why are these individuals in these institutions to begin with, and why are adults remaining in these institutions? So to look at this, we surveyed over 80 residential schools in New York State and out of New York State where New Yorkers are placed. And we found that once an individual reaches the age of 21, they are no longer entitled to educational programming, and so the role of the residential school ends. However, there's quite a number, over 100 or approximately 100 individuals who are remaining in those schools as adults because they're not being released to the community. OPWDD has an obligation to discharge plan for those individuals and to implement timely discharge plans so that those individuals can return to the community and participate in programming and employment and all of the wonderful things that young adults want to do.
How has the state responded to this lawsuit?
We haven't received a response from the state.
Okay. Just so my listeners know, I did reach out to OPWDD this morning. Let's talk about the kind of child that's placed in a special residential school, and then we'll get to what the state's responsibility is when it comes to the transition from a residential school into an adult care facility. So first of all, the kids. Who is placed in a residential school here?
Well, I'm glad that you bring up that issue because it really is going to flesh out how complex this issue is. The lawsuit that we filed is addressing just one issue of many that result in the over and unnecessary institutionalization of individuals with disabilities. So what typically will happen is a school district is required under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to provide educational programming for all individuals with disabilities within their districts. But oftentimes, if we have a child who may have complex needs, who may be exhibiting behaviors that are challenging in the school environment, schools will start considering other placements, usually special education placements. Usually those are segregated placements. And if they're not able to successfully educate those individuals in those schools, then they will be looking at a 24/7 option, which would be a residential school.
I assume this is more expensive. These residential schools would be more expensive than simply having a child with developmental disabilities being educated in the public school system.
That is a terrific point, and I think that the numbers would bear that out. the problem is in many rural areas of the state and in some of the congested areas of the state, there just isn't enough programming, supports, and services for educating these individuals. In addition to that, these individuals are in family homes typically, and they're not always receiving the supports that they're entitled to receive as being eligible for waivers in New York State. So, for example, a family may be approved for respite or community habilitation, but the ability to find a provider to meet those requirements or provide those services is very, very challenging. So as a result of that, we may have a student who is unable to get the supports in the school environment and or unable to get the supports in the community. And as a result, this recommendation for 24/7 residential care is the result.
So this is now, we've been talking about why children with developmental disabilities are placed in special residential schools. At what age does the state need to begin the transition process for these individuals? Because if the legal responsibility ends at 21, you can't just say, okay, you're done and go ahead, leave. There has to be a process.
Sure. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires the school to start transition planning at age 15 in New York State. And that means that the school district starts thinking about adulthood. What do we have to do to get this individual out and into the community?
That's 6 years before age 21. So that's quite a lead up.
It sure is. And what happens, or what is supposed to happen at that time, is that the school district will start inviting state agencies who may be able to play a role for these individuals when they graduate. What is happening is that often those players, for example, OPWDD, are not really coming to the table until the individual is 19 or older. And so OPWDD is aware that the individual will be graduating or aging out in a particular year, but because placements take so long to find, typically 3 years, those individuals end up remaining in these institutional settings when their right to educational programming has expired. And what complicates this even further is that some of those individuals are not receiving any programming. Residential schools are there to provide educational services, and if a person's no longer entitled to those kinds of services and is ready for adulthood, ready for employment, then it's problematic. They don't have services and supports to provide these individuals. And these individuals aren't entitled to community-based supports while they are in the institution. So we have quite a number of individuals who are really not receiving any programming while they're waiting to be discharged to the community.
Your executive director, Tim Clune, told the Albany Times-Union, quote, "The state's history of neglect of these individuals is unconscionable," in discussing with the Times-Union this particular lawsuit. Is it that the state is neglecting these individuals, or do they not have the placement capacity for these individuals?
Well, I don't think there's a distinction between the two. The state is mandated by law to ensure that people are not unnecessarily institutionalized. And the state is aware that there are individuals who will be aging out of residential schools and are able to participate in community-based placements. So certainly there appears to be a lack of community-based placements, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but that is kind of the heart of the matter, is that it's taking a long time to get these placements, there's not enough of these placements, and therefore the students remain in school.
So it seems like we have two problems. That you mentioned first the over and unnecessary placement of people with developmental disabilities at the beginning of their educational career, right, when they're younger, and now at the end we don't have enough places to place them.
That's exactly right. There's another aspect to this as well, which I wanted to discuss with you, and that is because these individuals are remaining in these institutional settings as adults, that blocks school-age students from being able to be placed in those residential schools. And the consequence of that is a history of sending many New York school-age students, kids, out of state to out-of-state residential schools. There's a lot of problems with sending kids out of state. They're far from their families. Their families are not there to monitor what happens to them. There is a growing trend of expose of abuse and neglect in these out-of-state facilities. And these are our most vulnerable kids. So sending kids out of state is really problematic. If the children in state that are in residential schools could be timely discharged, as they're required to be, then that would free up beds for individuals within the state to receive an education in that setting.
I think it was in October that the New York Times reported that the state does house more than 100 residents at a facility in Pennsylvania where, quote, staff members repeatedly used physical restraints in violation of state and federal laws, and both residents who complained were retaliated against. Is that what you're referring to, this particular facility, or a facility like this one?
Well, certainly Wood Services in Pennsylvania is one example. We conducted a year-long investigation there in collaboration with our sister protection and advocacy systems in other states, and we're looking at both kids and adults at Wood Services. They provide residential school services and adult services, and our findings there were extremely troubling. They're very well documented in our report, and our report is available on our website. I would encourage people to read that report and really find out what is happening to these individuals. But in addition to Woods, approximately 2 years ago, another residence in New Hampshire, where a number of New York students were sent, Lakeview Neuro Rehabilitation Center, was shut down due to the same kinds of issues: abuse, neglect, human rights violations. And more recently in Massachusetts, another institution was closed. It was investigated by the FBI, actually, for the pervasive abuse that was going on there.
Why is New York sending its children to these out-of-state placements?
Well, that is, again, a complex question, but one of the reasons, of course, is exactly the issue that we're trying to address in this lawsuit, is there are not enough residential school beds in New York State, and part of the reason for that is that individuals who are no longer school age remain at these institutions and block those beds.
So capacity is really at the heart of this issue, and the state's not recognizing that, or at least not dealing with it.
Capacity is certainly an issue, and as we briefly touched on before, the fact that there aren't enough community and local school-based services and supports that would support a child in the community, and then the child wouldn't be in need of residential placement to begin with. So
we have about 45 seconds or so, and I'm just wondering what the next step is here if you haven't yet heard from the state.
Well, it's pending litigation, and we expect the state to respond. We hope that the state will work with us and try to resolve this problem. We don't think it's a heavy lift here. Certainly, OPWDD needs to be starting this discharge planning process sooner and devoting its efforts to creating more community-based placements. At the same time, State Education Department really needs to look at why are kids going to these placements to begin with, and what can we do to support them.
And what's your website?
Our website is www.drny.org.
DRNY.org. We've been speaking with Julie Michaels Keegan. She's the program director for people with developmental disabilities at Disability Rights New York. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the Capitol Press Room received this emailed statement from OPWDD. The Office for People with Developmental Disabilities is not responsible for the placement of students in residential schools. Rather, that determination is made by the local school districts and the State Education Department. Nevertheless, OPWDD continues to work on an ongoing basis with individuals and their families to develop needed services in New York State. Each year, approximately 200 people who have completed their education requirements receive adult opportunities, both residential and day, in the OPWDD system. And finally, OPWDD cannot comment on ongoing litigation.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided by New York State United Teachers, a union of professionals in education, human services, and healthcare.